Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to go back to the 19th century, back to the 1800s. Remember, this has been called the Protestant Century because during this century, Protestant evangelicalism held the greatest sway ever in all of our history. It was a time of the start of the phenomenon of Sunday school, an explosion of missions to the world, huge Christian efforts for social reform, an enormous publication of Bibles and Christian literature. And all of this came out of the religious energy from waves of revival that happened during the beginning of the 19th century that we call the Second Great Awakening. But tonight we have to look at the other side of our Christian history during this century. Here's where we are in the schedule. After this lecture, we'll have 3 more left. I'm going to bookend this lecture with 2 case studies in which law established practices of exclusion and disadvantages for non-whites. Because starting with the 1600s and the codification of slavery, and then the slave codes in the 1700s, this is not an insignificant concept that law has been used to disadvantage. And it's not just individual prejudice or individual racism, but it's embedded also in laws. And the fact that I'm teaching these things and that you're here learning is considered by some Christian and non-Christian to be anti-American, to be unpatriotic. But even putting aside the fact that my ultimate loyalty is to Jesus, not the United States, I still consider myself a patriotic, loyal American. And I take the stand that is expressed in this quote that I want to share with you. This is from a book called American Exceptionalism and Civil Religion. It's written by John Wilsey, who's a Christian historian. And he talks about open exceptionalism and closed exceptionalism. Closed exceptionalism is where you think your country can do no wrong. It's innocent and it's, chosen by God and has a God-given mission. Open exceptionalism, he describes like this. In an open exceptionalist account of America, we affirm that America is different because it is a nation in which dissent is not only allowed, it is a virtue. Open exceptionalism opens the door for citizens to acknowledge, to address, and to rectify real American flaws, because in doing so, citizens express true love for country. So that's where I stand. So I'll open tonight with the case of the enslaved Black man named Dred Scott, whose case was considered in the Supreme Court in 1857. Dred Scott was born into slavery in Virginia in 1795, but he had labored for his master in the free state of Illinois and the free territory of Wisconsin. And Scott sued when his mistress refused to let him buy his and his wife and daughter's freedom when they were in a free state. And he took his case all the way to the Supreme Court, where the justices ruled against him, 7-2. And Judge Taney, who wrote the majority opinion, stated that Black people were, quote, I quote the Supreme Court judge, an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race. And the judge went on to explain that the Constitution did not have Black people in mind when it outlined the rights and duties of citizens. Instead, the Black person, and I quote again, the Black person had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. And this decision by the Supreme Court, the final arbiter of law in the United States, effectively closed the courts to enslaved Blacks. They couldn't sue for their freedom or pursue justice in the court system. And the American legal system basically had declared Black people to be something less than fully human. This and other events of the earlier decades of the 1800s, even before this, really frustrated and inflamed abolitionists. We're going to talk some more about them in this talk, but a few more words to set the stage. So I want to talk about a few compromises that led up to the Civil War. So in 1820, we have the Missouri Compromise, which added Missouri as a slave state to the Union, as a compromise for allowing Maine to be added as a free state. And so it's kind of starting to divide the country geographically in terms of free states and slave states. Then in 1850, we have the Fugitive Slave Act. And at this time, California wanted to enter the Union as a free state. And this was contested by Southern states who didn't want to lose the balance. And so to appease the Southern states, this bill was put in place to provide harsher penalties for runaway slaves. So up to this time, runaway slaves could go up to, say, Pennsylvania or wherever in the North where there was more freedom for them. According to this new act, they were to be recaptured and sent back with harsh penalties. So it really terrorized Black people up in the North. And then in 1854, we have the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which permitted the new territories of Kansas and Nebraska to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. And it really became a bloody battleground between slavery and anti-slavery forces. Settlers came rushing into those territories from both sides and fought, and blood was shed, and it was called Bloody Kansas or Bleeding Kansas. And the nation was very much on edge. And then 1857, 3 years after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, we have the Dred Scott decision. So, like I said, all of this is inflaming abolitionists. So I want to take a look at abolitionism. Now, I've got a slide here about Massachusetts, but it wasn't confined to Massachusetts by any means, but Massachusetts, especially Boston, was a hot spot for the abolitionist movement. Both men and women, Black and white, free, born free, fugitive slaves, ex-slaves, all sorts of people participated in this cause of abolition to get rid of slavery. And for many of them, not all, but for many of them, it was a continuation of the evangelical reforming impulse that came out of the Second Great Awakening. This was another thing that needed to be corrected according to their Christian beliefs. So there are all kinds of fascinating people to read about, all kinds of fascinating abolitionists. I'm just going to point out a couple things here. So we have the most famous white abolitionists from Boston, or from all of the United States, was William Lloyd Garrison. He was born in Newburyport, and for many, many years, he published The Liberator, which was an anti-slavery newspaper. And he helped found the American Anti-Slavery Society. Then we had women like Maria Chapman down here, who was a part of a group of wealthy Bostonians. She was born in Weymouth. Wealthy Bostonians who were against slavery and supported Garrison in his work. We have other women like this woman over here, Lucy Stone from West Brookfield, Massachusetts. She was the first female in Massachusetts to earn a college degree. She was an outspoken abolitionist, and she was actually expelled from her church. She went to the First Congregational Church of West Brookfield, and they expelled her from membership because she criticized churches who wouldn't condemn slavery. And then we have over here the Black man, Frederick Douglass, who was a Christian and an abolitionist who traveled a lot, but he spent a lot of time in Boston as well, working with William Lloyd Garrison. He's the most famous Black abolitionist. And then here's Sarah Parker Redmond. She was a Black female abolitionist born in Salem, Massachusetts, a great public speaker against slavery. And she really stressed the sexual exploitation of enslaved Black women. And then finally, we have over here a picture of a report, because there are no pictures of the women involved here. So this is the report from the Massachusetts Female Emancipation Society of Boston. And this was formed by a group of evangelical women. And this is just a small sample of the work done by Christian abolitionists in Massachusetts. In Boston today, we've still got things going on. So at Boston University, just last year, they added a center there for the Center for Anti-Racist Research. And it's headed up by this man, Ibram X. Kendi, who's written a couple of books that you might be aware of, anti-racist type books. And the Center for Anti-Racist Research is teaming up with the Boston Globe to create a newsletter called The Emancipator, and and they've been inspired by William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator. And I'll put a link in the follow-up email that I sent if you want to sign up for this. It's something brand new. I don't even think their first issue of it has come out yet, but you can sign up for it if you're interested. Being an abolitionist was dangerous. Even in the North, it could get you arrested or even killed. In 1835, a mob tried to hang William Lloyd Garrison. And in this picture over here, also from 1835, Reverend George Storrs was addressing the anti-slavery society in Northfield, New Hampshire, and he was arrested while he was praying. So why this anti-abolitionism in the North? Well, partly it was incited by Boston elite who profited from it, profited from slavery, both in terms of the cheap cotton fabrics that they got to make clothing out of in their factories. Part of it was that. Also, the coastline of New England and the northern states was the place where a lot of slaves were brought in. And there was a lot of money made in New England and Portsmouth and Boston and in Rhode Island, a lot of money made on the slave trade. So there was anti-abolitionism in the North, and it often led to violence. So we got the Christian abolitionists, and what was happening in the churches themselves. So what was happening is, decades before the nation split into the Union and the Confederate States, slavery had already frayed the unity of the church. And three of the biggest and most influential denominations all divided over whether Christians could own slaves and still remain in good standing. In 1843, the Methodists split over slave-holding bishops and clergy, and after the split, Southern Methodists allowed their clergy to practice slavery. The Baptists split in 1845 over slave-holding missionaries, and in light of what these Southern Baptists saw as an affront to the Southern way of life and the assault on the institution of slavery, they split, and the Southern Baptist Convention was formed. And the Presbyterians split over whether Presbyterians needed to pledge allegiance to the federal government and its stance on slavery. In the 20th century, the Presbyterians and the Methodists reunited. We even have a denomination called the United Methodists, but the Baptists never did, and the Southern Baptist Convention is still alive and huge. This is James Henley Thornwall. He was a theologian, preacher, teacher, and he was a writer of this time. And he was from South Carolina, so he was a Southerner. And in the years leading up to the Civil War, he articulated a theology of the spirituality of the church. And he said the church's only constitution was the Bible. And on the issue of slavery, the spirituality of the church meant that Christians could insist on the liberty of conscience, since the Bible nowhere explicitly condemns it. And so basically he taught that the political issue of slavery could be separated from church issues. So Thornwell's vision of spirituality allowed the church to remain silent on the most critical social and political and ethical question of his day. And this doctrine continues to influence the church in America, but it's selective. So this injunction against church involvement has not been withheld in debates over evolution over prayer in schools, over whether to overturn abortion. In those cases, it's been allowed, churches are encouraged to speak up and get involved in the political issues of the day. But this spirituality of the church reappeared in the fight against segregation in the 20th century. Don't get involved, church, that's a political issue. And today, in other fights that we're having, the spirituality of the church doctrine is invoked. So we're getting to the Civil War. So this is a picture of an actual Bible from a soldier with a bullet hole in it. And there are some stories of Civil War soldiers being saved when a bullet hit their Bible instead of their chests. But I just want to stress that the Civil War was a theological crisis because both sides claimed that God was on their side. And Christianity was everywhere present in the crisis leading up to the American Civil War. Both the North and the South used scripture as a weapon. And the Civil War was a religious war because it consumed the religious energies of a religious people. And just remember what we've said about this century, huge religious energy. And now that energy is being consumed on both sides by this war. Both sides said God is on our side. This is an example of a northern sermon and a southern sermon. And I don't have time to read them all, but in the North, they're saying the truth that man cannot hush and that God will not have covered up is the irreconcilable difference between liberty and slavery. Which will you advocate and defend? And from the Southern sermon, a couple years later, you are fighting for everything that is near and dear and sacred to you as men, as Christians, as patriots. Your cause, this is the South, is the cause of God, of Christ, of humanity. It's a conflict of truth with error, of the Bible with Northern infidelity, of pure Christianity with Northern fanaticism. And there were lots of these sermons on both sides. The Civil War was about slavery, although in the years after the South tried to revise their history, did revise their history books and moved away from the idea that it was about slavery. The leaders of the South took the step of seceding from the United States in order to protect an economic system based on the enslavement of human beings. And pastors and theologians supported the Confederacy by providing theological and biblical backing for the continuation of slavery. And just here again, here's Abraham Lincoln, who was against slavery. And this is some words of Alexander Stephens in 1861, who was the vice president of the Confederate States from 1861 to 1865. The duration of the Civil War, and he was later the governor of Georgia. And again, I don't have time to read the whole thing, but Abraham Lincoln here is talking about all men being equal. And if we say that the Negro isn't equal, where does it stop? What else? Who else could we say is not equal? Alexander Stephens said, Northerners, he said, stupidly clung to the outdated idea that the Negro is equal and hence conclude that he is entitled to equal privileges and rights with the white man. And then he goes on to say the Confederate government rested on the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. Voices, opposing voices. So in 1860, Lincoln won the presidential election on an anti-slavery platform. In April of 1861, secessionist forces attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina, starting the Civil War. In 1863, 2 years later, President Lincoln, by executive order, issued the Emancipation Proclamation freeing the slaves, and the war went on until 1865. In April of 1865, and it was the deadliest military conflict in American history. But this isn't a class on the Civil War, so that's all I'm going to say about that. No details about the Civil War, just that Both sides were fanatically religious about what they were doing. Both sides used scripture. Both sides invoked God's blessing. I just want to say a word about Christianity in the South after the Civil War. So I mentioned that they rewrote history. So a narrative about Southern society was developed that and Southern society and the Confederate cause was invented after the Civil War to make meaning out of this devastating military defeat. Here's one of the first books of revisionist history written by a Southerner, and it was called The Lost Cause. And the Lost Cause mythologies of the white priests mythologized this white pre-Civil War South and portrayed them as a virtuous group of tight-knit Christian communities who just wanted to be left alone to preserve its peaceful, beautiful civilization that was attacked by aggressive, godless North, and it took the focus off slavery. And many clergy and religious leaders in the South did not change their mind on the biblical permissibility of slavery, even though it was now outlawed. And the Southern historical explanation embodied in this lost cause mythology provided the model for segregation that Southern churches accepted after the Civil War. The lost cause was really a form of civil religion. It had its heroes like General Robert E. Lee. It had its saints, white women. It had its symbolism, the Confederate flag, and an explosion of Confederate memorials and statues were put up. And churches held ceremonies like Confederate Memorial Day. And in the South, after the Civil War, the connection between Christianity and the Confederacy was very visible in public spaces and in places of worship. Just briefly here, after the Civil War ended, from 1865 to 1877, there was a period called Reconstruction, where attempts were made to correct the economic and social and political legacy of slavery. But in 1877, Rutherford B. Hayes did a backroom deal with Southern Democrats in order to get himself into presidential office. And his side of the deal was that he was going to pull Northern troops out of the South. And the troops had been there to protect and supervise these Reconstruction efforts and protect these newly freed enslaved people. That was called the Compromise of 1877. And when the Northern troops were pulled out of the South, several groups in the South who were supported by most whites in the South started this sustained and violent effort to reclaim the South. And they referred to it as redemption. And they justified oppression and violence and a deliberate, systematic reign of terror to prevent Black people from voting, from obtaining economic independence, from exercising their full humanity as citizens and people in the image of God. And conditions for Black people, formerly enslaved Black people, degraded quickly. These are some cartoons from the cartoonist Thomas Nast of the time, portraying what was going on in the horror for Black people. This cartoon here, under this skull and crossbones, says worse than slavery. It was a terrible time. And I've got the other bookend of a case study of law. This is another Supreme Court decision, and this was in Louisiana. In Louisiana in 1891, it had been made a law that seating on trains was to be segregated, and Blacks had to ride in separate cars. And Homer Plessy, who you see here, was 1/8 Black. So I think that would be a grandparent. He was 1/8 Black, and he took a seat in the white car to test this ruling out, to test this Louisiana law. And the rail company had been informed that this was going to happen, and he was arrested. Homer Plessy was arrested after he refused to moved to the colored car. And his lawyer argued in court that this Louisiana law violated the 14th Amendment that guaranteed equal protection under the law for citizens' rights. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court again, who ruled that his rights hadn't been violated. And the court said, just because the law says he goes in a separate car, that doesn't mean that he's inferior. And they legalized the standard practice for the next 60 years of something called separate but equal. The separate but equal doctrine legalized segregation. And that happened, that ruling was May 18th, 1896. So just celebrated the anniversary of that last month. Legalized segregation, separate but equal. But separate never meant equal. In schools, in public restrooms, and accommodations, nothing. It was never equal. Non-white people got inferior everything. And again, the law was used to disadvantage Blacks. And I close tonight with just a few words about the Black church, because no study of Christianity in America can be complete if it omits the Black church. So again, this was an era of ever-present danger, the reality of violence and death, especially during and after Reconstruction, when the whites were trying to reclaim the South. And the church became a refuge for Blacks. After Reconstruction ended, they were abandoned and expected to make their own way in a legally segregated society. And so they retreated to the safe haven of the church, which had always helped them survive oppression. And the Black church became responsible for so many dimensions of Black life, trying to meet a range of needs. The Black church was there to meet the educational, the social, the economic, and the political needs of the Black community. It was almost like a nation within a nation. And it was the single most important institution in the Black community, was the church. And Black congregations, poor as they were, they made sure that the collection plates were full, and they had an economic cohesion together, and they pooled their resources. Black women became radicalized with gender consciousness and standing up for the right for Black women to preach and have their own missionary societies and raise their own funds and have control of that money. So just in summary about the Black church, it was a source of community where Black people worshiped as their parents and grandparents had, and they continued to seek and find solace and hope when equality did not follow freedom and where opportunity seemed to elude them. And I close with just this last question to ponder. What could the white church learn from the Black church? Okay, next time we're moving into the 20th century, and we're going to be moving away from evangelical Protestants' influence into a time of Protestant uncertainty and ceaseless tumults and Christian retrenchment and defensiveness. And that'll be next time. So we'll see you then. Bye for now.